everybody. This is Jazmin Mangra, and this is the next installment of Silos to Sirens, which is a series of Zoom conversations that I host with women, femme, and non-binary student leaders on campus, as well as alumni. I forgot to introduce myself last time, so I'll do that this time. I'm an Indo-Guyanese, Panamanian, and Filipina queer and genderqueer identifying student at Mānoa. I'm currently getting my major in peace and conflict resolution for my bachelor's degree, as well as an ethnic studies certificate. I identify as a settler scholar here, and yeah, I would also just like to ground us in the fact that we are in the Hawaiian Kingdom currently, and this place has nurtured and fed us during our time here, as well as being the ancestral lands of Kanaka Maoli. Today I have a very special guest, Yu Noguchi, and we're just going to get into it. So would you care to introduce yourself, Yu Noguchi?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Yu Noguchi. I identify as a queer, non-binary Japanese American settler here in the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I was born in Osaka, Japan before moving here when I was 2 years old and basically has lived here all of my life since then. I went to University of Hawai'i, Mānoa, majoring in psychology and women's studies, also doing the undergraduate certificate in peace studies as Jazmin. Oh, Jazmin's in the major, but I'm doing the certificate. I did the certificate there. Also minored in Japanese. Then shortly after graduating, I moved to Japan for about 2.5 years, pursuing my master's degree in global studies, studying transgender identity making among Japanese Americans. And then I recently just came back to Oahu and, resettling myself here in the communities here. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you for more background, like how did you end up choosing this sort of like psychology pathway and this mental health stuff, as well as the women, gender, and sexuality studies? Because a lot of people are curious, what kind of things you learn in those fields and like why you would go into them, for example, to see what kind of opportunities you could get after you graduate.
Yeah, for sure. So, actually, when I first started off my academic journey, like most Asian kids, I was kind of in the pre-med kind of pathway. I was in the radiology technician program at KCC, Kapi'olani Community College is where I started off. And then I took one semester of human anatomy and I was like, that's it, like that's not for me. And then I was doing some introspection within, my own self-identity, and my own like personal development. I kind of came to the realization that therapy was something that was really helpful for me growing up, and also something that I would like to give back in the community that sort of way. So, for some background, my parents separated when I was a junior in high school, and the reason why my parents separated was because my father had some, pretty bad temperament issues, anger issues, and things like that. So that's the reason why they separated. And, I have two younger siblings. So it was really traumatic time for our whole family. And so all of us, were going to therapy, for years after that, basically. And that's really something that kind of like, helped ground me and help, process all of that childhood trauma and also the trauma of parental like separation, the process of divorce. So, I felt like, okay, this is something that really helped me. This is, I want to give back in the same way through therapy, mental health. So that's why I started, changing my major to psychology. And I was pretty heavily involved in Girl Scouts growing up. So, women's rights issues, gender equality issues was always something that was on the forefront of my mind, since I was a really young child. And so with that, I learned that University of Hawai'i Mānoa had a women's studies department. They recently changed their name now to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. But when I was there, it was Women's Studies Department, and they offered a major program and they also offered a minor program. So my original intent was, to do the minor, because it's about 5 classes, and I felt that it would give me a more well-rounded perspective in going into mental health. It give me a, an insight on, another perspective outside of a white cis male, college educated man, which is, which, unfortunately is where all like psychological studies is based off of. especially in here in Hawaii, we have such a diverse like ethnic and racial population. So, learning about other race and ethnic perspectives in regards to mental health was really important for me too. So I felt that, going into women's studies was something that would be really helpful for me in that aspect. But I started taking classes and I just learned so much that I ended up double majoring in it, is how I ended up being a double major in psych and women's studies. But and yeah, and that's how I became, really interested and involved in like, um, feminist theories such as like intersectionality is a really big one that I'm really like strong proponent of understanding like oppression and privilege, that we're born into, the systems of oppression of this world. Women's studies was the program that really like helped me understand that, understanding my place in the world and, to be able to better help our communities, we need to be able to better understand where we stand in the placement in our, placement of like oppression and privilege. And that could be not just race and ethnicity, but like gender, economic class, geography where we're born into and things like that. So I'm really glad that I kind of, fell into the women's studies program there.
Wow, beautiful, you, beautiful. Yeah, it sounds like you really took like an interdisciplinary approach,
Mhm.
and that you were very open-minded with everything, which I think is very much needed in the fields of psychology specifically too. Um, I'm curious how you would what response you would give to someone if they ask you like, oh, how do these things relate to peace and conflict resolution?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of briefly touched upon it, but like the aspect of like intersectionality. So every single one of us, whether we say it or not, we hold multiple identities. So like the easy ones that, come to mind quickly are like gender, sexuality, race, ethnic identity, and also like geography, like where, what communities that we're born or we were raised in. So, living in such a racialized environment, like the Hawaiian Kingdom is separate from the United States, but our legal systems are still under like American federal law. So a lot of American laws, culture, politics, and stuff does impact Hawaii here. And so, with America being such a racialized state, race politics is something that definitely affects us here. Hawaii is really interesting place growing up in because one of the more um, we're one of the most like racially diverse, places in the entire planet. Because of the just the history of Hawaii, when with the arrival of the missionaries and plantation era, we had like so many immigrants coming from like the Asia Pacific coming in, settling here, creating such multi-ethnic communities here. Um, so understanding that generation. So I'm kind of like I consider myself a newer immigrant because I was born in Japan and I came here when I was 2. But I still have really strong ties with my Japanese family in Japan. Compared to some of my classmates who are like fourth, fifth generations, they don't really, it's hard to keep contact with your relatives, um, from your homeland, when you're like 4 or 5 generations out. So, with that, like me being first generation, um, being part of my identity, like I grew up speaking Japanese language, for example, right? Compared to my classmates, they don't know how to speak Japanese, or the only person in their family that still is able to speak Japanese, or like their oji-chan, oba-chan, their grandma, grandparents, or great grandparents even. Um, so like, things like that kind of like plays into, the way that we grew up, the way that we, um, walk through this world, and also the sort of like, the daily politics in our world, like the rules and policy that university or the state puts into place, kind of like social norms, like Hawaii, even though it's very ethnically diverse, and Hawaii culture is like a forefront here. Japanese culture is also pretty, dominant here. Like here in Hawaii, we have like bentos, right? Like everyone knows what a bento is.
Mhm.
Um, But bentos, like even the word bento lunchbox came from Japan. So the prominence of Japanese on culture in Hawaii is very strong. So that really plays a different role, growing up if you're not, Japanese. Like for example, if you're just, you're native Hawaiian or you're like Filipino or you're from the other Pacific Islands like Samoa. You don't really see yourself represented in Hawaii as much, compared to someone like me who is Japanese and, grew up here. So, things like that, you know, we don't realize it, in day-to-day lives. And we don't realize it because the system was made. So we don't realize these interplays and the intersections of power in our daily lives. So that's how I'll kind of like, briefly talk about to my, friends and family. But yeah, that's kind of my roundabout way of answering your question. I hope I was able to. Um, sorry, that's my dog over there.
It's all
Back
good.
to the question though.
Hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that you sort of touched on that. Like, we have cities that are very ethnically diverse and or racially diverse. And what it does is it creates these explosions of culture, and people can't help but to meet and mingle and try different foods and learn different languages, which is beautiful. But sometimes when there gets to be too many of these pockets and people don't like intersect very much, there can be like a little bit of that siloing, a little bit of that vacuum, because like um, I'm Latina and I'm also Asian, and so I've noticed that when I'm in certain spaces, with my community members, I've noticed there's like anti-Blackness or like, anti-Indigenous language being used sometimes, and it's very unfortunate. And I've noticed that a little bit on island, which, has to do with like if you're not exposed to people all the time and you're just seeing what you're seeing on the media, you're gonna sort of like fall to some of these generalizations that you see that's used in the media. But what I really appreciate about my time at UH is that I have been able to go to these student organizations and meet people like you that are like constantly having conversations. I really feel like sharing our stories is the best way to like break all these barriers, so that we can all help each other with our individual unique struggles in various communities. I
Exactly.
do, yeah, yeah. Um, I do want to touch on like sort of the queer experience.
Mhm.
Um, I think can be a hard subject sometimes in some of our communities to talk about, or to embrace or to wrestle with. So I'm just curious if you feel like, do you feel like the environment that you grew up in was conducive to being like your full authentic self in terms of like sexual and gender identity and sexuality? And what would you say to someone who maybe is not in an environment that they feel safe or comfortable to be their whole self in? What would you say about that for your experience and for others?
Yeah, sure. So, gender and sexuality was really Um, it wasn't really something that I thought about too much growing up, to be honest. My home environment was a little bit too chaotic for that. So, looking back on it now, as an adult, after years and things have settled down, I really think that just my home environment was like just so chaotic that I just didn't have the mental space, to think about gender and sexuality. My own, gender and sexuality, growing up too much. I think, if, things were different at home, and I probably would have like, came to realizations about my own identities a lot sooner. Um, but growing up, I lived in Pro City, which if Hawaii folks know that Pro City is a very like dominantly Japanese American community. So a lot of my classmates had like last names like Yoshimura or like Tanaka or Watanabe or something like that. But very much it's an older Japanese American community. So unlike my family who, like my mom, came to Japan like 25 years ago, um, there are mostly communities that have been here for like multiple generations, 4, 5, 6 generations. So, that kind of like local mindset is really strong here, with such a, when you're here for that long, for, multiple generations, you really settle in and you start intermingling with others. And in Hawaii, we have like, the local culture, which it's not really, dominated by one like ethnic identity or race. It's just like the intermingling of all these ethnic groups, from the plantation period, creating this like really strong like local identity. And with that local identity, there is aspects of like toxic masculinity, like, growing up, I used to hear, my dad telling my brother, like, boys don't cry, like if you're gonna if you're gonna cry, like I'll give you something to cry about, you
Mm.
know, like there is aspects of that. You know, just making, like if you're a guy and you're like feminine or whatever, you're considered like weak, or like showing your emotions or like weak. And I think like in the current generation now, like, I see my brothers and my sisters, and we're only a couple years apart. My sister is 6 years apart, my brother is 4 years apart. But even that, couple year difference, I see a really big change. Because when I was growing up, it was really like, like gay jokes was really common,
Mm.
you know. So like here in the Hawaiian Kingdom, in Native Hawaiian culture and history, there is a like a third gender, since male, female, wahine, kane, and then there's also the mahu. And the mahu are individuals who embody both the feminine and the masculine energy within themselves. So they're like, a third gender. And they're in the past and in the present, there were, very respected and revered spiritual leaders, cultural leaders, and healers really of the community. Um, and so Mahu was a really, it was a really respected individual, a respected title. But growing up, if you're like, acting too feminine or whatever, the joke was like, what, you Mahu? Is used in a derogatory way.
Mm.
So that really, when you hear that all the time growing up, from such a young age, it does implant like some sort of, you know, image or stereotype that, being gay or whatever is a negative thing rather than something that should be celebrated, right? So, so growing up, it was kind of like that. And I, in my personal experience, going to high school and stuff, I feel like, Hawaii, and, people here are very open to like sexuality. So, even though, there was, those derogatory like Mahu jokes going around, it was kind of like, or if you're gay or lesbian or whatever, it was kind of like, we'll openly accept them. It wasn't that big of a, issue in my time growing up in high school. But gender was something that really wasn't talked about.
Mm.
Um, you know, like, gender expression, whatever, like, we live in a island, so you see, girls in t-shirt, shorts, and slippers like all the time. You
Mhm.
see like titas and the hair buns or whatever. And they may not be dressing like traditionally feminine, but like no one, cares or, makes comments about their way they dress and stuff, right? So like, gender expression wasn't really like too much of an issue. But like, you know, transgender, transitioning gender was kind of like this mysterious thing that like I never knew anyone who was trans, growing up. It was always something that I only seen on TV. Um, and with American media, they ended up being white people.
Right.
So it kind of like, implants this image like, oh, I'm growing up here in such like a, ethnically, racially diverse place, but I don't, see trans people. I don't see the people talk about it. And when they do talk about it, they kind of talk about it in a negative light. So so transitioning or being transgender like has to be a white thing. It was kind of a this like, subliminal messaging that I had in my head. And also something you had to like, process through in therapy and such afterwards. But that's kind of, like what it was like when I was growing up in high school. And then in when I went to university, there was like a really big resurgence in Native Hawaiian culture and history because the TMT protests were going on. So the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, which is the most sacred land site in all of like in Native Hawaiian culture and history. They were their plans to desecrate that aina, that land, to build basically 30-meter telescope, which is like multiple like football fields, wide. So there was a lot of people that came and gathered in order to protect and prevent the construction of TMT. And with that also was a resurgence of, really just Native Hawaiian history and culture, so understanding, like that we live on native land. So like local culture here is different from Native Hawaiian culture, because Native Hawaiian culture has been here, for hundreds and thousands of years. It's the Native Hawaiian people, the Kanaka Maoli, who have been stewards of this land, for all that time. And we only arrived, a couple hundred years ago, recently. So um, so when we're talking about, privilege and power here, local culture is part of that too, right? Because local culture a lot of the times take dominance over Native Hawaiian culture when really we're living on Native Hawaiian land. But going back to the resurgence of Native Hawaiian culture and history, part of that too is like learning about Mahu, like learning that there is non-white um, you know, communities, basically, non-white communities and cultures that do have, other gender identities than strictly a binary male and female, man and woman. So, with that, so learning about Mahu, like learning about, the communities here, but also learning about like, other, third gender identities like across the Pacific Ocean, like the Fa'afine in Samoa. And more recently, later on, I learned, Japan also has like X gender, which is like their own native, like non-binary identity there. So kind of realizing that like, no, like this is not a white thing, like this is not just a white people thing. Third third gender identities and more really have been in existence in other cultures for hundreds of thousands of years. And the only reason why our communities and society now is like kind of restrict people into these, category boxes of just man and woman is more of a recent phenomenon, based upon, the missionaries and Christian missionaries and stuff like that. So, so part of my, I guess, gender identity, gender, journey was also like heavily impacted with the resurgence of Native Hawaiian culture and history and learning, about that and my place in that. So yeah, that's kind of, my long kind of story, but um, that was kind of, my journey through it.
Okay. Thank you so much for touching on that history. Yeah, it's definitely like sometimes touted as like, oh, that's a thing that white people do. But
Mhm.
like actually, this has been, So
Yeah,
let's reclaim that sort of like idea that people are fluid and that we can
exactly.
because we
Mhm.
are all things.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious, like, so you spent some time in Japan. I'm curious, what that was like for you. Were you like received well when you were, going about? Did you feel like there were like certain areas were a little bit more acceptant than other areas?
Yeah, so Japan is really interesting. As a society, they're more, I wouldn't say they're tolerant as more as they're more passive, like non-physical, non-verbal in their views about certain things. So like like some parts of the United States, like if you're visibly trans or visibly gender non-conforming, it could be a real physical danger, going to the restrooms, or just being out in public. It could be a real physical, danger, just, being visibly trans. But in Japan, there's not really like a fear of physical safety. Um, in regards to being trans or anything like that. It's more of like microaggressions, like people will stare and and like make really strong eye contact with you, or they might be kind of like whispering or anything like that. But very rarely will you get like, confronted and asked or anything like that. So it's a very different place to be in. Um, like I always talk to my friends and say like, like racism, like sexism, like transphobia, like any form of discrimination really, they exist everywhere. It's just like the level and perception of it is just different.
Yeah.
Because Japan definitely is you know, like politically and society is pushes these, very binary aspects. Um and if you're like non-conforming, you're kind of like seen as kind of like weird or anything like that. But again, you're not really in physical danger. And Japan is like have been pushing this idea for decades now that they're like a racially homogenous nation, of only 100% pure like ethnically Japanese people, which is a lie. But like that's the image that Japan as a country, as a nation state, has been pushing and has been like slowly like assimilating within the communities there. So the Japanese people in Japan have a very like strong image and idea of what a Japanese person should look like. So Japanese women should look like this, a Japanese man should look like that. And if you're, divergent from it in any way, then you're kind of seen as like not Japanese. So I mean, you'll see this in cis Japanese people too who travel outside of Japan or have lived outside of Japan. They would say like, yeah, like I don't really quite, fit into Japan because they're have more of like an individualistic mindset as compared to like conforming into like Japanese society
Mhm.
and their sort of ideals. So me, like I'm ethnically like 100% Japanese, like both parents of, both sides of my family are only Japanese. So I'm not mixed in any way. I'm not, bi or multiracial or anything like that. And I speak, relatively fluent, like conversational Japanese. So you would think that I will like, fit in pretty well. But there was always something that like outed me as not real, like not Japanese. Um, I think it's, part of it is like the way I was dressed and my hair also. My hair was a lot shorter in Japan.
Mhm.
When I was growing up, I had this like really like cool like undercut thing going, and my hair was kind of like it was short enough where it was like, styled upwards. So I didn't quite, so my hairstyle also wasn't fitting into like Japanese like styles, that were in at the moment. Japanese girls tend to have like shorter length, like longer hair, and then guys tend to have kind of like what I have a little bit right now. It's more similar to this. So my haircut was like really, it was really
Yeah.
easy to spot me in Japan because not a lot of people had like undercut.
Mhm.
Um, and my mannerisms were different because growing up here, like Hawaii people were kind of loud, so
Mhm.
we're very expressive,
Mhm.
verbally and also like with her speaking with our hands and body language and stuff. So there's always something that kind of like outed me as not Japanese, even though I am Japanese.
Mhm.
Um, so there was always something that like people were like, and that's really what kind of like outed me more than like my gender presentation or anything like that. So it wasn't necessarily more of a gender thing. It was more like, yeah, like you're not Japanese kind of thing. So, and speaking to, some of my other like Japanese friends too, like any gender divergence or sexual divergence that, they displayed out in public was just seen as a foreigner thing. Because in Japan, there's such a strict idea of what, a Japanese person should be.
Mhm.
So it was just kind of like, so I was talking about earlier, like, that I kind of grew up thinking like being transgender or like, transgender people or just like strictly white people thing. In Japan, it's kind of just seen as like a foreigner thing. Like you don't really see Japanese people, um, or the image of Japan doesn't fit into, sexual or gender divergence or anything like that. So it's a really interesting place to be. Japan, the queer communities in Japan have been working towards more of acceptance of, gender and sexual diversity. But uh but yeah, but just the idea of it is seen, more foreign than anything else a lot of the times.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining that for us, because uh it's that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, right? The
Yeah.
proverb. And
Mhm.
I remember learning that one in school in my Japanese class, and um we learned a bunch, and the one that I loved the most was Junin Toiro, 10 people, 10
Mhm.
colors. So like,
Yeah.
so there you have these like different proverbs that mean very different things. But the 10 people, 10 colors, like if you have one person, you have one person. That's that their own person, that's their own shape and color, size, whatever, and that's beautiful. Um, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like back during like the shogunate, or like just, like early times, it used to be common that like um men would be intimate partners with each other, I think, and women as
Yeah,
well.
so actually, Japan is also really interesting in that it's it's also one of those countries where, in pre-modern state times, gender and sexuality was a lot more fluid. So like, homosexual practices between like the samurai and even like the monks are pretty well recorded. Um, and actually, um, when they were modernizing, in like the 19th century, um, unlike most like European or like Western nation states, homosexuality was not outlawed. Like it was not a legal crime to engage in homosexual activity. Um, it was it was a law, like, an anti-homosexuality, like sodomy law was put into place for just 1 year. But that was because of the influence of a French ambassador. So it was like an external force trying to apply, Christian Western, laws into place. But in Japan, it just didn't make sense. Just culturally in the history, and Japan has such, over 1,000 year, plus history, right? So the culture is just, it's not something that could be that easily influenced, within a few decades,
Right.
especially from such a vastly different culture.
Right.
So the anti-homosexuality law was basically amended. So it was taken back like a year later. Um, and Japan is kind of like that a lot. You can see kind of this practice in their current laws too as well. Um, Japan doesn't have a like an anti-gender discriminatory like law. It prevents like legal employers from discriminating based on your gender identity. And kind of the thought process behind that is that if you were to put and like, a law for something, um, whether it be for protection or whether it be like a discriminatory law, you have to state that that topic is an issue in the first place. So, for example, in the United States, for as much as like the right wingers say that you know, like gender sexuality should like not be public or da 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 da.
Don't say gay.
It should be a private thing. Actually, they're the ones most public with it because they're the ones pushing through all these legal, legislation bills, you know, out in, the White House, and within like state legislator. So in Japan is different. It's like we're just not going to acknowledge it.
Mm,
So we're not going to acknowledge it. So there is no protective laws in space, but there is also no like discriminatory laws in place. So
mm,
it's kind of like this weird gray space.
yeah.
Japan is in, it has also been like historically in. Um, but I also like to say that even though Japan as a society is very like conformist, their subculture in Japan has always been like very strong. So there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
different subcultures, and that's how, they gain popularity because they're fighting back against that conformity. So even though like that conformist like societal pressure is really strong, there has always been, different groups of people like fighting back against that conformity in various different ways. there's like, various different like underground punk movements.
Hmm.
Throughout the years, there's been underground like political movements, but also in other more pop culture ways, such as fashion. Like if Lolita fashion, for example, like punk fashion. Japan has like a very diverse, like fashion scene, especially in like more underground like subculture groups. So, there has always been people for as strong as the conformity is in society, there is always is as much pushback, from the community in various different levels.
Yes, we love it. We love to see
Yeah,
it.
it's fun, yeah.
Um, so speaking of fashion and expression, I did want to show a couple of photos to our viewers for our series. Oh, hold on. Okay, here we go. Can you see these?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Would you mind, I know you touched on it briefly earlier, but would you mind sort of explaining the chronology of these and what inspired you to um, uh, try these different cuts with your hair?
Yeah, sure. So, growing up, Asian kid growing up, I had really long hair actually. So my hair was usually like, mid torso for a lot of the time.
Um,
Starting like middle school, I kind of like cut it into a bob and then like just donated all, that lock of hair to like, to make wigs for people with cancer and such.
mhm.
So like from middle school to like end of high school, I kind of alternated between like letting my hair grow out kind of long and then cutting it into a bob, but then letting it grow out, kind of like back and forth, that sort of thing. But my hair was also the shortest it's ever been was like, to my shoulders, growing up. And partly because something I really struggled with in my gender journey was cutting my hair actually, because I felt that, my hair was, a symbol of my gender identity. And so like cutting my hair was not only a public expression of, my gender expression, but it's also like an acknowledgement that I wasn't cisgender. Um,
Mm.
so, cutting my hair was actually like almost like a 6 month long journey that I had to talk with and process with my therapist, kind of like saying like I really want to do it, but I'm scared of the repercussions.
Oh.
Um, I wasn't scared of like my family's reaction to it. My family has always been pretty open and accepting.
Mhm.
But it was more like this internal like transphobia, I guess, where cutting my hair felt like an acknowledgement and acceptance of who I really was. Um, and then I was at this transitionary moment in my life where I finished my associate's degree at Computer Learning Community College, and I was transferring over to the big leagues at the University of Hawai'i, Mānoa. And I was partaking in the study abroad exchange program that was taking place in Norway, of all places. Um,
Ooh.
I didn't know anyone in Norway. And the other partner, the other person that was going, with me on this trip, I also didn't know her either. We were meeting for the first time on this trip. So it kind of felt like, good time to cut my hair because I was gonna be in an unfamiliar environment, and that felt easier because basic no one would have known me before. They will only know me as like short haircut you. Um, so that's why I cut my
Mm.
hair. So the first photo on the left here is when I cut my hair short for the first time. So it's kind of like this short on the side, with a little bit longer, you know, a little bit longer on the top, and I had to like swipe to the side a little bit. And I kind of had that haircut for the next like 2-ish years. I used to go to the barber and get the sides trimmed up. Um,
Nice.
like every month or so. And then the second picture, it was during COVID. So during COVID, I just kind of like let my hair grow out for the first time in a while. And Partly because we couldn't go out to get haircuts and stuff, and also because classes and everything were online, so no one was seeing me anyways. So I kind of did whatever I wanted. So I also kind of like bleached and dyed my hair quite a bit during this time. Um, but I eventually kind of like, wanted to cut my hair again, but I also kind of liked it long. So I kind of went in between and basically got this like undercut situation going. So I basically like shaved like all of my sides and the back of my head and just left like the top of my hair pretty long.
Hmm.
Um, so I had this, cool haircut going on with me. And I kind of had that for the next couple years. I kept different variations of that up when I was living in Japan as well. And then I kind of had like a, bang moment. I don't really, have bangs as much. But was finishing, I think I was in my last semester, doing my graduate program. And I kind of just wanted something little bit different. So, so I basically cut, had the whole thing cut real short. So I had bangs, so it was like too short to like have up anyways. So I was kind of rocking that for a little bit.
Nice.
And basically kind of let it grow out again.
Mhm.
And now I'm kind of like in that in-between phase where it's, kind of long. It's more in the longer length that I had in the past couple years. Um, but it's come to the point, one of the reasons why my hair was cut so short was because um I felt like having long hair was like really feminine, and at that point in my life I was just trying to like veer as far away from like femininity as I could.
Yeah.
um I was like, if you have long hair, that means you're a girl. Like that was kind of like, it's not true, but that was kind of like the mindset that was kind of like ingrained into me. So that's
Mhm.
why I was leaning away from long hair for a really long time and had my hair cut real short. But now I'm at that point in my life where, like I'm comfortable in my gender identity. It's not really an issue for me anymore. And, hair is a part of gender expression, but it's not your gender identity.
Right.
And so now I kind of growing out my hair, a little bit, and now I'm kind of rocking this current hairstyle that I have going on right now.
I love that so much for you. I didn't realize when we had our talks before that the cutting of the hair was such a significant moment for you. Like it was like a shift, almost paradigm shift for your like mindset and like almost like liberation.
Yeah, it really was. And they say like hair holds like a lot of trauma and stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and it was partly that, but it also felt like I was relieving myself of this like, societal expectations of gender identity or gender expression. Parts of it kind of stayed with me for a little bit, still, but it felt my first moment of like gender liberation, just getting my hair cut for the first time.
Yay. I won't go too much into mine because I want to focus on you, but I did put mine on here because I know you were feeling shy. So I just threw a couple of mine
Thank
up
you, thank
there.
you. Mhm.
I also growing up would go from like butt length hair to like a short bob regularly. And that was something that my mom would have us do, not forcibly, but just be like, "Hey, do you guys want a haircut?" And then we'd be like, "Yeah, sure." So I didn't realize how formative that was for me to learn like, oh, it's okay to cut hair. Sometimes we cut our hair and then sometimes we grow it out, and that's okay. Like it goes in cycles.
Mhm.
And I think my mom even did cropped hair at one point, and to me that was not unusual. But looking back on it, I think that was something that was maybe not necessarily a hard decision for her to make, but not something that people her age or in our cultural community were doing. So
Mhm.
I think I took for granted back then, being able to witness that. Oh, my mother cut her hair really short. That's just a thing that women do. Or, like my sister did a half shave, sort of like you have in that first picture on the left. So this was like I was like, oh, this is a thing that women do, like regardless of sex or gender or sexuality. This is just a thing that all people can do. And I think I took all of those moments for granted. But here I am now. The picture on the left for me was taken in the fall of 2022. After I landed here in Hawaii, I had planned for several years to shave my head, but I was waiting for the right moment. Um, and I knew I wanted to do it out of state. At that point, I didn't know where I was going to be for school. I just knew that that was going to be the moment that I did it. And so leading up to it, I did grow my hair out. So everybody before that moment, knew me as the Jazmin with the butt length hair, which I showed you a picture of.
Yes.
Um, but everybody after that moment knew me as Jazmin with the shaved head. So it was very, the season had changed for me. And
Mm-hmm.
the season was the long hair to the shaved head. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, I think perhaps not as significant, I think, but it was definitely a moment where I was like taking control of my body in a
Mm-hmm.
way that I didn't necessarily have
Mm.
before
Yeah.
that. And honestly, such a sensory experience. Like,
Sure, yeah.
uh,
Feeling the hair in the back of your neck for the first
it's
time.
unreal.
Yeah.
Like, don't sleep on shaved heads, y'all. Like, we're both telling you if you're feeling it, if you're wanting it, go for it. Half, undercut, whole thing, whatever you want to do. Like, it's really sensory. It's very therapeutic.
It
And
is.
then, yeah, and then this just shows like
Also much
different growth patterns,
cooler.
different growth patterns that I had.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes it ends up looking more femme, sometimes it ends up looking more mask. If I'm gonna go out dancing, I tend to go femme, but if I'm like doing like errands and things like that, sometimes I want to be a little bit, it just it honestly depends on the day.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I do still identify as a woman, but definitely very like queer in terms of like expression and how I feel sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I just wanted to show our individual hair journeys.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yes, thank you as well. I think we're going to segue into yeah, what kind of advice would you give to someone that like doesn't necessarily identify as queer or genderqueer or LGBTQ plus, but they
Mhm.
want to know more? Like they have questions and or maybe they have like a relative who is going on a sort of journey and they feel uncomfortable asking, or they don't have a relative, So if they have questions, or like all these flags and all these acronyms that we have, and they're like, I don't know where to begin. What kind of advice would you give that person?
Yeah, for sure. I would say that honestly, even if, person identifies like cisgender and straight, I would say, just examine your own identities, like, just have a moment to sit with yourself, like, because I've talked to, a bunch of my guy friends and stuff, and some of them has said to me like, yeah, I'm a dude, but I feel like I'm just a dude because that's just the way society is. Like I was born in this body and I feel like I'm just playing this role. And I'm like, okay, yeah. But, you know, it's okay if you want to explore, a little bit outside of that, right? Um, and then, and honestly, like, exploring just for yourself, I think it's healthy and it's fun. It's scary sometimes for sure. Just because of the society that we live in, especially if you're living in an area where it could be like, a physical danger. Definitely it's a scary thing, but it's also just so liberating, to be able to, just explore a part of yourself that you've never explored before. um, so, I would say, first things first, like, even if you don't identify as trans, or if you don't, identify, or you just identify as like a straight person or whatever, just take a moment to like just think about it, just try just a little like introspection. Um, just kind of like sit with it for a little bit, because it's always good to just, think about your own journeys and your own identities, and how they play in the world. So, so first thing I'll say is just, just think about it for yourself, you know? And then second thing I would say is to, get in contact with like your local LGBT like organizations and resources. Um, because, like social media is great, because it allows, queer people, to be in touch with other queer people over like, a great distance, and also allows a way for, them to educate our allies and stuff. But social media, the danger of social media is that it's so easy to spread misinformation as well.
Mhm.
Because, as part of my, queer journey, I was watching a lot of YouTube videos. So I was watching a lot of like transitioning videos on YouTube, a lot of like transgender YouTubers. Um, and they all had very differing opinions, and also a lot of them, or almost all of them, were white. So that also like kind of ingrained in me, like it was kind of a white people thing when I was growing up. But also like some of the things that they're saying, um, and they were speaking of their own experience. But as with any community, the queer community is also very diverse. So all of our experiences are very diverse. So not one person can nor should speak for the entire community based upon their own personal journeys. But and when you're young and when you're like, trying to learn, for yourself or for others, the first information that you receive is like really, susceptible, and you're learning going forward. So a lot of these messages that I was hearing from these YouTubers was that, like your like gender dysphoria has to be like extremely bad to the point where you can't even like take a shower with the lights on, or you have to be like disgusted with your body. And and those experiences are the experiences of some people in our trans community, but it's not the experiences of all. And I've always been, there's aspects of my body that does give me, gender dysphoria. But I've always felt it, seen it more as like a neutral lens, um, as compared to like more negative. And so I felt that because of that, because my experiences didn't match experiences of these YouTubers, um, that I wasn't trans, or like I wasn't trans enough. So it was an invalidation of my own identity. And so, social media is great, tool to explore and learn from others, but it's also really easy to get that sort of negative or misinformation as well. So I would say like, go to like reputable organizations. So like your local like LGBTQ organizations. And oftentimes there's a more like community oriented events or groups as well that you can reach out to. If you have the ability to reach out to um like a queer elder, someone who has, been queer, have been comfortable being queer, have experienced being queer, out in the real world, and is willing to, guide you or answer some of your questions. I would say if you're coming from a genuine place of heart, the other person usually can tell what your intent is. But just being like, just asking for permission, like, hey, you know, I'm exploring, or I'm an ally and I want to, genuinely learn more. Um, like, can I ask you, a few brief questions? Um, you know, and also understand like, the possibility that they might say no. Because the likelihood of it is that they've been asked that same question by a lot of people in their lives, friends, relatives, and even strangers as well. So, so going to someone in the community is also great, but also, be mindful of the kind of like emotional labor that you're asking of people. So, so be willing to put in your own research. There's a lot of great, books and resources, documentaries even, that, are able to explain, the history of the queer community, the culture, um, what the acronyms mean, like what are these terms and definitions? And there's a lot of great resources out there. And if you really don't know where to start, again, like go to your local like queer LGBT like resource center. Most universities have one. University of Hawai'i Mānoa has a great, LGBT resource center. And we also have, community organizations out here who they do, work for the communities, but they're more centered around people of gender and sexual divergence, such as or sexual and gender diversity, such as like HRC, Health Hawaii Health Reduction. Sorry, I can't remember the whole acronym, but HRC is another great organization that does, great work for the LGBT community here home in Oahu. So, so just reach out to them and they'll be more than happy to like at least point you in a direction to go or give you resources to help you get started. So that would be my sort of advice that I would give to people who are exploring for themselves and don't know where to start, or also allies as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, just to add on to that, yeah, I think so if you are a student at UH Manoa, you can go to the LGBTQ plus center. It's in Queen Liliuokalani Center, QLC. They're on the third floor, right next to the Career Center. And I would also add that when asking folks and reaching out to folks, especially if you're an ally and it's not necessarily your journey, be aware of the emotional labor that it takes for people to divulge their experiences and their truths and their identities. Because but before you, what you might not know is if they have been through a certain level of bullying and reproach. So just to be mindful of that. I think we can, for the description of this video, we can leave a couple of books and resources for folks that are interested. And yeah, dig into the community. There are folks like you here that like go out and we'll discuss and give like educational workshops on things like this. So be aware of that. So libraries might have things like that. But we'll definitely leave some things in the description for folks that are curious and want to learn more. And I just have one last question for you.
Yes.
This obviously, a lot of this work, we're working with people, we're working with emotions, bodies, and traumas a lot of times. I'm curious how you make time and space for your own joy and what that looks like for you.
Yeah, sure. So definitely, when you're working with a community, there are times where it gets really dark and heavy and you just need a space to breathe. So sometimes it's hard, but my best advice is, try to leave work at work. And when you're at home or you're, enjoying your, moment or, time by yourself or whatever, just use that time just for yourself. Like don't try not to let, the other outside things impact you during your time of rest. When you're resting, enjoy that rest and use that time to process your emotions and stuff. Um, you know, taking a time to breathe, literally, take a moment to like go outside, like, get some sunlight on your face, take a deep breath. I personally like green, as you can tell by my background and my jacket here. So I kind of like, looking at the trees. So taking a little quick walk, take bathroom breaks, make that your little walk. Maybe use a restroom that's, a little bit out of your way, but give you that, like 5 minutes to just, be away from your work area or environment. Just to take some breaths, breathe, be outside for a little bit. Um, and also, most importantly, like lean into your other community members, because there's always people who are wanting to support your work, whether it be friends, family, or even coworkers. And lean into them if things are getting, too overwhelming. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Whether it be in like actual projects or just like, hey, like, do you just have a moment where I can just talk? Can I just, process things with you? Um, that's great. And as a psychology major or a former psychology major, I'm a huge proponent for therapy. So if you have the
Yes.
time, space, and resources, go for it. Um, and
Mhm.
reach out to a therapist. And a therapist is kind of like dating, is how I tell people. Like, the first therapist you meet won't necessarily be the therapist that will work for you.
Yep.
Um, if you need immediate help, then of course, utilize, that therapist to the point that you need. And when you feel that it's time for you to move on, move on to your next therapist. Um, but look, when you're looking for a therapist, be open to being to like shop around, see what kind of therapist is out there, who you click with, who you vibe with. Because having a professional to just, sit and listen to you like rant or talk about your day or whatever, it can really like unload a huge like mental and spiritual burden just off your back. So, see a therapist. I know that's not accessible all the time, but there are resources out there also that are able to help you find a therapist that is within your accessibility range. So yeah, when you're by yourself, like, try to leave work and outside, pressures outside, and just enjoy whatever moment you're having, whether it's at the beach or reading a book or just taking a nap. Just try not to let those things like, bother you when you're in your peaceful time. Um, Go on walks, take bathroom breaks, breathe, touch grass, you know, um, lean in on your community members, whoever they may be. And then don't be afraid to seek professional help, like a therapist or social worker is also great too. They're, well versed in community resources. Um, if you need medication, no shame. Like, it's just like taking, your everyday vitamins, or just like grandma and grandma taking their cholesterol meds, you know, just another part of your daily routine. Like, if you need to go see a psychiatrist, go see a psychiatrist, um, chiropractor, whatever. Don't be afraid to seek, professional help when you need to. So those will be my advice and how I, take care of myself during, chaotic times.
Thank you, you. Yeah. If anyone's interested in looking for a therapist, the place that I've had the best luck with is Psychology Today, because you
Hmm.
can go on there and put like all of your filters like down to the
Yeah.
insurance that you have and like wherever you're living. At
Mhm.
least if you're part of the United States, or within the United States. Yeah, those are all great tips. And thank you so much, you, for having this conversation with me. I hope that you all feel inspired to live your best lives and your most authentic lives. Thank you, you, so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yay.